For a moment, it looked like Turkey had cracked the code. A booming economy, the second largest army in NATO, a government with big ambitions, and for once, the money to back them up. Many were saying it out loud. This is the country that leads the Muslim world into the 21st century. But here is where that story gets interesting. That economy now running the highest inflation of any developed nation on earth. That currency down more than 85% against the dollar since 2018. And the government with the big ambitions just threw its most popular political rival in prison. Something broke in Turkey. The question is, how bad does it get from here? To understand the scale of what's happening, you have to go back to the early 2000s. Because what Turkey built in that era wasn't just impressive, it was genuinely historic. Before 2001, the country was a mess. Hyperinflation, a collapsing banking sector, an IMF bailout that left the economy in tatters. Turkey was the cautionary tale, the country economists pointed to when explaining how not to run a developing nation. Then, something shifted. A new government came in, pushed through deep structural reforms, tightened fiscal discipline, and critically rebuilt the central bank as the independent institution that would make decisions based on economics, not politics. The results were extraordinary. World Bank data showed Turkey's GDP rising from roughly $240 billion in 2002 to nearly $962 billion by 2013. In little more than a decade, the economy nearly quadrupled. Between 2002 and 2012, extreme poverty fell from 13% to 4.5%. Moderate poverty dropped from 44% to 21%. Millions of people who had never had access to basic services, healthcare, schools, running water, suddenly did. That is not a rounding error. That is a civilizational shift. And it wasn't just the numbers. Turkey's location had always been strategically unique. It sits at the exact crossroads between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, controlling the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the only maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Empires have gone to war over those straits for centuries. Turkey controlled them and also held a seat at NATO's table, a customs union with the EU, and a growing reputation as the rare Muslim-majority state that had figured out how to be modern, democratic, and Muslim all at once. EU accession talks opened in 2005. International investors poured money in. Foreign companies set up regional headquarters there. The brand of Turkey, as a serious, stable, and rising power, had real weight. When the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East in 2011 and governments began to fall one after another, the question being asked in foreign policy circles everywhere was, which model do these countries follow? Turkey's name came up again and again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was working. Scholars debated the Turkish model across peer-reviewed journals and major policy outlets. Carnegie, Brookings, Harvard, they were all writing about it. The idea that electoral politics, economic reform, and Islamic identity could coexist in one functioning state, and that was genuinely exciting to people trying to think through what a post-authoritarian Arab world might look like. And that distinction, a Muslim-majority country that was actually working, meant everything. That is the country Turkey was supposed to become. That is the version of this story that made sense. And then it started going wrong in ways that were almost impossible to watch. The first cracks appeared in economic policy, and they have a name: Erdoganomics. For President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, high interest rates were not a tool for controlling inflation. They were the enemy. He argued publicly and repeatedly that interest rates actually cause inflation, a position that runs directly against the consensus of virtually every mainstream economist on the planet. He once called high interest rates the mother and father of all evil. He described rate hikes as treason. His theory was simple: you keep credit cheap, keep money flowing, and keep the economy growing fast enough that the political rewards outweigh the economic damage. And for a while, if you squinted hard enough, you could almost convince yourself that it was working. But then, in 2021, Erdogan went further. Central bank governors who raised rates against his wishes were fired. 3 of them in the space of 2 years. Another governor, Nasi Agbal, was appointed in late 2020 and immediately started hiking rates to stabilize the lira. The currency recovered. Investors came back. Confidence returned. And he was fired 4 months later. The message to markets was unambiguous. In Turkey, monetary policy answers to one man, And that man does not believe in orthodox economics. The lira resumed its collapse almost immediately after Akbal's dismissal, and the conditions for disaster had been set. In the fall of 2021, the government introduced what the IMF later described as a new policy model, one that pushed rates even lower, even as inflation was already climbing. The result was immediate and brutal. The lira went into freefall. The IMF documented what happened next. Successive rate cuts triggered a full-blown run on the currency in December of 2021, so severe that the government had to intervene with billions in foreign exchange reserves and engineer a complex new deposit protection scheme just to stop the bleeding. It didn't stop the bleeding, though. It just slowed it down. By October of 2022, Turkey's official annual inflation had hit 85%. Let that land. Not 8.5, not 18.5, but 85%. The UK was dealing with inflation around 11% at its peak and calling it a national emergency. The US hit 9.1, and it dominated every news cycle for months. Turkey hit 85%, and the government kept cutting rates. To understand what that does to ordinary people, consider this illustration built from Turkey's own official inflation figures. A product that cost the equivalent of $10 in 2020 would cost around $12 by late 2021, and then nearly $22 by late 2022 when inflation peaked, and then $36 by the end of 2023. And by late 2025, that same item cost roughly $70. Not because of a single crisis, not because of a war or a natural disaster, but because of 5 consecutive years of double-digit inflation grinding through every purchase, every salary, every household budget in the country. Food prices were up nearly 28% in 2025 alone. Housing costs were nearly up 50%. Education costs up 66% in a single year. Think about what that does to a family trying to plan anything. A couple saving for an apartment watches those savings get vaporized year after year. A small business owner can't price a contract more than a month out because nobody knows what anything will cost. A retiree on a fixed pension watches her purchasing power cut in half, then in half again. During the 2025 protests, one woman told reporters she had to pick up odd jobs just to support her 2 children, and that her 17-year-old son had no hope for the future. That quote is not an outlier. That is the texture of daily life for millions of people inside what was supposed to be the Muslim world's model economy. And here's where it gets structurally dangerous, because Turkey's inflation problem isn't just a policy problem, it's a trap. Turkey imports almost all its energy. Oil, gas, coal, nearly all of it comes from abroad. The International Energy Agency has flagged this energy import dependency as one of the country's core structural vulnerabilities. And the European Commission lists it explicitly among the challenges preventing Turkey from reaching its potential. In normal times, that's manageable. You earn foreign currency through exports and tourism, and you use it to pay for the energy that keeps the economy running. But when the currency collapses, and the lira has lost over 85% of its value against the dollar since 2018, falling to a record low of 44 lira per dollar in March of 26, imported energy, that suddenly costs far more than local currency. Higher energy costs push up transport prices. Transport prices push up food prices. Food prices eat into wages. Wages that are already getting hollowed out by inflation that hasn't dipped below 30% since 2021. There's no clean exit from this sequence. You can't lower energy costs without a stronger lira. You can't get a stronger lira without credibility. And credibility is exactly what has been systematically dismantled. Businesses shorten their planning horizons. Why sign a 12-month contract when you don't know what costs will be in 3? Households flee the lira, moving savings into dollars, euros, gold, real estate, anything that actually holds value. The more they do that, the more pressure they put on the very currency that they're fleeing. That is dollarization. And once it spreads widely enough, the central bank loses its grip on economic behavior entirely. Because the economy is now effectively running on 2 currencies, and the government only controls one of them. The IMF described this exact dynamic after the 2021 crisis. Policies that were meant to support growth instead exacerbated vulnerabilities by lowering reserve buffers and increasing dollarization. Once businesses and households expect depreciation, they behave in ways that guarantee it. The central bank was eventually forced into the U-turn that Erdogan had spent years fighting. Rates were hiked all the way to 50% in March of 2024. levels that reveal just how severe the inflation fight had become. Since then, the bank has been carefully cutting again, down to around 37% by January of 2026. The OECD forecasts that Turkey will still carry the highest inflation of any of its members in 2026. The IMF's 2025 Article 4 consultation put it plainly. Inflation was falling slowly, remained far above target, and delayed re-anchoring of expectations could raise the probability of a shock that reignites the entire cycle. In other words, the emergency may be over, but the danger? It's not. But here's the thing. The economy, as bad as it is not actually the most alarming part of this story. Because what happened in March of 2025 was something else entirely. And if you want to understand why the whole Muslim world is now paying attention to Turkey, this is the moment you need to understand. And before we get there, if this kind of analysis is what you're here for, hit subscribe. This is exactly what Fall of Nations does. And the next deep dive is already in the works. Ekrem İmamoğlu was the mayor of Istanbul, Turkey's largest city, 16 million people. He was also Erdogan's most dangerous political rival, the one candidate who, in virtually every poll, beat the president head-to-head. In the 2024 local elections, the opposition swept across the country, winning every major city. İmamoğlu won Istanbul by a landslide. He was about to be formally nominated as the opposition's presidential candidate for 2028. Then, the day before he was arrested, Istanbul University announced that it was nullifying his university diploma, citing alleged irregularities from a transfer 30 years ago. Under Turkish law, presidential candidates must hold a university degree, with one administrative decision. Erdogan's biggest rival was potentially barred from ever running. The next morning, police raided his home. Over 100 people were arrested alongside him. Politicians, journalists, business people. The charges? Corruption, extortion, bribery, money laundering, espionage, and alleged links to terrorism. İmamoğlu denied everything. The Council of Europe condemned the arrest. The European Parliament condemned it. Human Rights Watch condemned it. Germany blocked the planned sale of 40 Eurofighter jets to Turkey, citing political tensions. The lira immediately crashed to a record low, and the central bank was forced to sell more than $8 billion in reserves in a single week just to defend the currency. Hundreds of thousands poured into the streets of Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, the largest protests that Turkey had seen in more than a decade. Despite being in prison, İmamoğlu received over 15 million symbolic votes in his party's presidential primary. By February of 2026, he had been indicted on espionage charges and now faces a prison sentence of 15 to 20 years if convicted. The Brookings Institution described what Erdogan was building as a new era of seamlessly consolidated rule around one man, with no real political competition, separation of forces, or checks on decision-making. This wasn't just a political story, it was an economic warning signal. The Venice Commission had flagged back in 2017 that Turkey's constitutional reforms carried an intrinsic danger of degenerating into authoritarian rule. When that danger becomes real, when the courts become unpredictable, and when the rules change based on one man's political needs, businesses will pull back. Foreign investors reassess. The very reforms that stabilized Turkey after the 2001 crisis depended on people believing the rules would hold. That belief, once broken, is extraordinarily hard to rebuild. So why does any of this matter beyond Turkey's borders? Because Turkey occupies a position no other Muslim-majority country can easily replicate. It is embedded in NATO, the alliance's second-largest army. As NATO's leadership publicly confirmed in late 2024, it is deep economic integration with Europe. Bilateral goods trade with the EU hit a record 210 billion euros in 2024, making Turkey Europe's fifth-largest trade partner. And for decades, it served as a bridge between Western security structures and the Muslim world, between European markets and Middle Eastern politics, between modern institutions and Islamic identity. After the Arab Spring, Turkey was the country that scholars and reform movements pointed to as proof that there was a viable third path. Not secular authoritarianism, not theocracy, a functioning democracy with a growing economy in a Muslim-majority country. This mattered enormously because the Muslim world, from North Africa to Central Asia, was watching. Young populations in Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, and beyond were all looking for a template, a proof of concept that you didn't have to choose between Islam and prosperity, between identity and modernity. Turkey was that proof of concept, and when a model state becomes economically destabilized and politically captured, the damage doesn't stay inside its borders. It strengthens the argument made by autocrats across the region that liberalization is fragile, that integration with the West is a trap, that democratic institutions are luxuries that developing countries cannot afford. Those arguments were already being made. Turkey's decline gives them new ammunition. Turkish television dramas had built enormous soft power across the Middle East. Research has documented their reach from Morocco to the Gulf, shaping perceptions of Turkey as modern, aspirational, connected to the world. Turkish investment had been flowing into Somali reconstruction, Libyan politics, Qatari infrastructure, and Palestinian institutions. Turkey was a player in the new architecture of Middle East influence. When the economy collapses and the courts become a political weapon, that soft power fades. The investment dries up, the influence shrinks, and the financial links are real and direct too. Turkey and Qatar's central banks operate a bilateral swap agreement worth $3 billion, a mechanism that shows how Turkey's instability ripples into the financial calculations of other regional states. When Turkey wobbles, the question in Doha and Riyadh and Amman isn't just about Turkey. It's about what Turkey's instability means for everyone connected to it. So here are where things stand in 2026. Inflation has come down from its catastrophic peak, from 85% in 2022 and 75% in mid-2024, down to about 31% by early 2026. That is genuine progress, and it should be acknowledged. The central bank has been running the most painful interest rate regime in the country's modern history. Rates peaked at 50% in 2024 before gradually being cut back. Government officials are projecting inflation could fall into the upper teens by the end of 2026. And some analysts consider that achievable if nothing goes wrong. The disinflation is real. The question is whether it is durable, because nothing about Turkey's environment is stable right now. The lira hit a fresh all-time low in March of 2026, partially driven by new regional conflicts pushing energy prices sharply higher and triggering a flight from emerging market currencies across the board. The central bank was forced to halt its rate-cutting cycle and burn billions defending the exchange rate. Simultaneously, the political system is navigating the aftermath of the largest internal crisis in a decade. With the country's leading opposition figure on trial and facing decades in prison, and the next presidential election still on the horizon. The IMF has cautioned explicitly that upside inflation risks and a volatile external environment will require sustained vigilance, particularly around foreign exchange risks. What that means in plain language is that the recovery is conditional. It depends on no new shocks arriving before the credibility has been rebuilt. And in Turkey's neighborhood in 2026, new shocks are not in short supply. Turkey still has real strengths, and they're worth taking seriously. Its strategic location has not changed. The Bosphorus and the Dardanelles are no less important in 2026 than they were in 1926 or 1826. Its industrial base has not disappeared. The country still manufactures, it still exports, it still employs tens of millions of people in productive work. Its trade relationship with Europe remains vast, $210 billion in 2024 and likely growing. Its military capacity within NATO is genuine and significant. The country has recovered from shocks before. The 2001 crisis, which was in many ways more acute, produced the very institutional reforms that powered an extraordinary decade of growth. The ingredients for recovery still exist inside Turkey. The institutions that made the 2000s boom possible were not invented from scratch. They were rebuilt from what was already there. But the IMF's warning is one that deserves to be heard clearly. Delayed re-anchoring of expectations raises the probability of a shock that could reignite inflation and undermine confidence. The line between recovery and relapse in a country that's been spending down institutional credibility for a decade is thin. And every time the lira falls to a new record low, that line gets a little thinner. Something broke in Turkey. Whether those pieces can be reassembled and what it means for the Muslim world if they can't is one of the defining questions of this decade. The ingredients for recovery exist, but so do the ingredients for another collapse. And the difference between those two outcomes comes down almost entirely to institutions. The unsexy, invisible architecture of governance that nobody celebrates when it works, and everyone blames when it fails. So what do you think? Is Turkey past the worst of it, or is this just the calm before the next storm? And what does it mean for the region if the country that was supposed to lead the Muslim world can't hold itself together? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more.